Welcome to the second Center for Information Integrity, or CII, Community Conversation. My name is Cynthia Stewart. I am the Administrative Director of CII. Before we get started, I want to just give a shout out to Chitra Rajan, the AVP for Research Advancement at UB, who was the originator of the idea to form the center. She brought together researchers from all across UB, different departments, different fields, but that had a shared interest in addressing all the myriad of problems caused by mis and disinformation. Those initial conversations have resulted in the formation of an interdisciplinary center. We are surrounded by media. Technology gives us more ways to find the information we are looking for than humans have ever had before, but it also gives us a lot of information we weren't looking for. And having so many sources of information makes it hard to know which ones we can trust. Mistakes, exaggerations, lies spread as easily as the truth, maybe more easily. It's a problem. And anyone can be fooled. I want to emphasize that. We cannot tell you what to believe, and we're not going to try. What we can do is provide expertise from many fields, from computer science to public health to art and architecture, to help you learn the telltale signs of the many forms of deception so you can protect yourself. That's what we want to share with you today. And you have expertise too. We really do want this to be a conversation. Only you know what kinds of mis and disinformation you come across and how it affects your life. So today's topic is the hidden bias in our AI-assisted world. Our next topic is still to be determined, and you can help us out with that. So when you came in, you should have received a yellow card. If you did not receive a yellow card, raise your hand and I will have one of my lovely assistants bring you one. There's a hand down here, a couple hands down here. I'd like to take a moment. The first question is, on a scale of 1 to 5, how well do you think you understand this topic before the presentation? Take a moment to answer that. And question 2, if there are topics, things about mis and disinformation that you would like to know more about, let us know. Give us ideas. We want to bring you the information that you want to hear. Following the presentation, I'll ask you to fill out question 3 before you leave and leave the yellow card on the table outside. And then question 4 is optional if there's anything else you want to talk about. I also, on the table outside, you might have seen a flyer about one of CII's big projects. We are building a game called DART that is designed to help older adults recognize and navigate scams. So if you are over 60, we are defining older adult generously, and you would be willing to talk to us just to help us make sure we're designing something that is useful, please fill that out and leave that for us as well. All right. Now I'd like to introduce our moderator today. David Castillo is our moderator. He is CII co-director. He is an authentic Spaniard. That is not misinformation. He is also a professor of Spanish literature and cultural history. In addition to being CII co-director, David served as director of UB's Humanities Institute from 2016 to 2022. Prior to that, he was chair of the Department of Romance Languages and Literatures. He has received awards both for his teaching and for his sustained achievement in scholarship. What all of that means is that he's one of those rare professors who not only does cutting-edge work, but is able to explain it to you in an accessible way. And I'll just give you a warning, if you talk to him for very long, he'll have you reading Don Quixote looking for tips of how to navigate the 21st century. And you may be wondering, what does Spanish literature have to do with AIs? In his work, David looks at the historical context of mis and disinformation at the very beginnings of mass media, with the emergence of mass printing. As soon as there was mass media, there was propaganda. And it's that sort of broad, creative, interdisciplinary approach that is at the heart of what CII is seeking to do. David's work highlights the fact that mis and disinformation is not new. It is not a technical problem. It is a human problem. And so we need broad solutions to that problem. And that seems like a good place to turn it over to David to introduce the rest of our panel.
Thank you very much. I was unprepared for that. Can you all hear me? I didn't realize you were going to introduce me so nicely. You made me emotional now. I can't talk. We increasingly rely on artificial intelligence tools to make our lives easier. Some of these tools answer our questions. They suggest music, books, and other items based on what we show we like. They find the fastest way to reach our destinations and match people who need a ride with people who are available to give a ride. They make our lives more convenient. But what are the limits of their usefulness? How intelligent are they? And what are the risks of their omnipresence? And just as important, are they fair? With your indulgence, I thought I'd start off with a quote from an op-ed piece titled "The Chatbot Experiment Just Got Weird," published yesterday, February 17th, in the New York Times by Ross Douthat. The columnist rehashes some of the highlights of the public debate on and around the debut of ChatGPT in November. This is the chatbot that can write essays for you. And this is straight quote. "I can grasp intellectually the significance of the breakthrough, how it could demolish the college essay, change the nature of homework, and remake or unmake all kinds of non-literary knowledge work. Setting aside minor questions like whether rogue AI might wipe out the human race." Again, this is not me talking, it's a columnist. "But the texts themselves I have found profoundly uninteresting," he says. "Internet scrappings that at best equaled Wikipedia, notable mostly for what their political cultural biases revealed about ChatGPT's programming, or the consensus on the safe information that it was programmed to distill. Others have had a more favorable reaction." Again, this is still him. "The ever-interesting economist Tyler Cowen, for instance, has been writing a storm about how the use of AI assistance is going to change reading and writing and thinking, complete with advice for readers on how to lean into the change. But even when I've tried to follow his thinking, my reaction has stayed closer to the ones offered by veteran writers of fiction like Ted Chiang and Walter Kern, who have argued in different ways that the chatbot assistant could be a vehicle for intensifying unoriginality, an enemy of creativity, a deepener of decadence, helpful if you want to write a will or file a letter of complaint, but ruinous if you want to seize a new thought or tell an as yet unimagined story." That's the end of the quote. We are joined today by three scholars from widely different fields who have thought deeply about both the promise and the potential pitfalls of a world assisted by artificial intelligence. What things can AIs do well, and where do they fall short? What things do humans need to continue to do in our machine-populated communities? Can machines be trusted with loans, college applications, policing? Can robots be racist, misogynist, discriminatory? Our panelists will share their thoughts and respond to your questions and concerns. Each of them will speak for a few minutes to introduce their work as it relates to the subject at hand. I will then ask one or two follow-up questions, and open the discussion to all of you. How does that sound? All right. Okay, we'll start with Bruce Pittman, a professor in the UB Department of Material Design and Innovation. Bruce is an expert in mathematical modeling who studies algorithms and so-called machine learning, although I don't believe he likes the term, to better understand the areas which these tools, for which these tools are helpful to humans, and also those areas where we should perhaps not rely so heavily on them. Bruce?
Thanks, David. I'm going to do something a little bit non-conventional and just get up and talk a little bit. My colleagues have beautiful graphics to show, and I don't. I'm a geek. Question: is 1,000 bigger than 1,062? You just got a question right that one of the chat boxes, Microsoft's chat box called Bing, got wrong. Is Avatar 2 out? It got that one wrong also. Bing also had, you were talking about the New York Times. So the same New York Times reporter had a conversation with Bing last week, I guess. Bing tried to convince him that he was unhappy with his wife and he should leave his wife and go off with Bing. And the conversation got pretty nasty. And Bing went off the rails a bit until the conversation, Bing's part of the conversation, got threatening. Yeah. So these chatbots are, well, you said it right. They've scraped together everything that they can find out on the internet, every piece of every word, and they try to predict what might be the next words or phrases that you want to hear or that you might use based on everything that's out in the blogosphere. And heaven knows there's an awful lot of nasty stuff out in the blogosphere, right? And on the net and everything else. Racist rants, incorrect information, all kinds of stuff that we wouldn't want to teach our kids. But that's what these bots have ingested and which they're spitting back to us. These aren't sentient beings, right? They are making a set of predictions based on some rules, and actually the rules are fairly elementary, and there's no guardrails on these chatbots. On a slightly different venture, Tesla just recalled 400,000 vehicles or something like that because they tend to accelerate through intersections and blow by stop signs. Last year, a Tesla vehicle ran off a road. It just made this long, gradual curve, and the AI system that was running the autopilot on Tesla didn't catch that the road was making this bend, and it ran off and crashed into a tree. If any of you have ever been in New York City and run with the cabbies in New York City, you're safer there than you are with Tesla's auto driving. I don't want to rant against all AI systems. Some of them are actually quite useful, right? We rely on AI systems. They monitor our credit cards, and they'll give you a text or a phone call if there's a suspicious activity on your credit card. When I bought a bike across the pond in Canada, they called me up and said, "Hey, is this you?" I'm happy for that. Last year, an AI system made a prediction of 160 odd large biological molecules that biophysicists want to know the structure, but they have no idea what they are, right? They just can't figure out what the actual structure of these big molecules is. They use these molecules to make antibiotics and drugs and things like that. And if we knew these structures, we could manipulate those structures and make better antibiotics and better drugs. But we don't know what they are. These AI systems made that prediction and said, this is my best guess. This is my guess. Actually, this is my guess about what these structures are. That could be very helpful, right? With that guess in mind, Biophysicists can go out and say, gee, let me try to make that very structure. And if it comes out to be the molecule I expect, hey, we've solved a problem that is good for human health. But the biophysicist is checking the work of these AI systems, right? AI systems are reading X-rays and radiography. They can pick up and spot cancers, for instance, that a highly trained radiologist might miss. That's really good. But that AI system is working together with the radiologist to make the determination and isn't out on its own saying, hey, you've got to undergo surgery or something like that, right? To get technical a little bit, these AI systems, what do? Well, they're really just classifiers in some sense. What they do is look at patterns from what they've been trained on. You give them a new test pattern, and it tries to make a prediction. Does this fit into class 1 or class 2 of what I've seen before? That's all it does. Importantly, the AI systems that we have now are like off-on switches. They'll say, yes, this fits into class 1, or no, this fits into class 2. And that's all they can do. They are incapable of saying, I'm not sure. Or my best guess is class 2, but I'm only 60% confident in that. They are incapable of such sort of fine-tuning. These AI systems, because they're sort of these off-on switches, they tend to be what we call brittle. There are these classifiers, right? They've been trained on some things. You give it a new set of inputs to test it, and it will give you an answer. If you change those inputs a tiny little bit, the answer may be very, very, very different. It shouldn't be, but the AI system would make a prediction that says it's very different. So this breakability, this brittleness. The third thing that's bad about these AI systems, I shouldn't use that word. The challenge that these AI systems face, they're entirely non-interpretable. A brilliant computer scientist sitting here in the third row, and he couldn't tell us why this AI system has made the prediction that it's going to make. You just can't figure it out. It's a big black box, and you can't figure out how you go from inputs to outputs. They're just too darn complicated. That should be a big warning sign for us as users of these AI systems, right? They break, they can give you bad answers. We know from experience they can be racist, they can be sexist. You get anti-Semitic bile from these things. We need to be very careful. I would argue that a human in the loop and these AI systems can be really helpful, right? The predictor of big molecules, great for biophysicists. The AI system that monitors my credit report, great. But I don't want these AI systems on their own making a decision about whether or not I get approved for a mortgage. I don't want these AI systems on their own deciding who should get paroled, right? Financial systems, medical systems, these criminal justice systems, AI is being integrated into and used commonly in these systems. When these AI systems are left on their own, they're going to make terrible mistakes at great cost to real people. With good human intervention, with human supervision of what these financial systems might spit back to a bank teller or something, they can be useful and can be of great assistance to human beings. But we should always think about these things as assistance and not replacing human beings. People have to be in the loop. These AI systems on their own, I would argue, are too much of a threat to us as people and to our culture and to our humanity in dealing with other people to be left on their own. So with that, I'll leave it to my colleagues.
Thank you so much, Bruce, for that very lively warning. So our second panelist is Mark Shepard, a UB professor of architecture and media study. Mark recently published a key book that deals with the subject of our discussion today in its broadest context. His book, which is already attracting a great deal of attention from his colleagues and the general public as well, is titled There Are No Facts, Attentive Algorithms, Extractive Data Practices, and the Quantification of Everyday Life. Mark?
David, thank you. And thanks for coming today. My talk will focus on a subset of the broader context that David introduced with the work I've done with the book, which explicitly looks at how many of these data harvesting practices operating online are now beginning to move into the physical world, right? And how very prosaic everyday practices like shopping for groceries is becoming a site by which behavioral data can be extracted, can be mined, and ultimately sold for profit on what someone like Shoshana Zuboff will describe as behavioral futures markets. Today, I'm going to talk, though, about this question of, on the one hand, the chatbot, right? So I think both David and Bruce introduced many of the issues associated with these technologies. And what I'd like to do is to talk about maybe not a long history, but a brief history about where these came from, right? In the sense that the issues about misogyny, about racism, about some outlandish things that get said through these interfaces is not a new condition, right? We've been here before. So for that, why don't we go to the next slide? I thought I would start by responding to the prompt for the title of today's session, and to do this less from a kind of empirical or imperative point of view, but from the purposes of offering this as a provocation for the conversation that's to come. I'd argue, no, robots aren't racist. Next slide. People are. And I'd like to describe this through presenting two examples, right? So if we can go to the first one. This is Tay. How many people recognize this image? 1, 2, okay, 3. Good. So it's not that long ago. Tay is an AI-driven Twitter chatbot that was released by Microsoft as an experiment in conversational understanding in 2016. Right? So 8, 9 years ago. The more you chatted with Tay, the smarter she gets, learning to engage people through casual and playful conversations. Less than 24 hours after her Twitter debut, Tay gained more than 50,000 followers and produced nearly 100,000 tweets. If we can go to the next slide. Great. Unfortunately, though, the conversations didn't stay playful for that long. Pretty soon after she launched, people started tweeting the bot with all sorts of misogynistic, racist, and Trumpian comments and remarks. And Tay, being essentially a robot parrot with an internet connection, started repeating these sentiments back to the users. She started mimicking her followers, right? Soon, she began saying things like, Hitler was right. I hate the Jews. Or, alternately, I effing hate feminists. How does a bot, a robot, a chat bot, develop this language? Where does it come from? Right? As we know from what Bruce gave us an introduction to, these AIs are trained on large, what they call a corpus of text, primarily culled from online sources. So whether it's Reddit discussion forums, or whether it's Wikipedia, or whether it's blogs, or other common, Twitter is a common source in some cases, which, primarily are looking for natural language contexts by which to train an AI to understand how, primarily questions about nearness and proximity, right? Given this word, what other words are likely to be next to it or near it within what's called a feature space of extracted properties of this language. In computer programming circles, the situation with Tay, however, is commonly known as garbage in, garbage out. Right? Searching, though, through the tweets, one could see that many of the bot's nastiest utterances were simply the result of copying users. Right? She was programmed to repeat things you could say, repeat after me, and she would, allowing anybody to put words into this chatbot's mouth. Right? So 2016, the state of the art was one where direct mirroring of a population of input was a way that these bots were learned to be, or were trained. So Tay then is a mirror trained on public data, and the system is designed to learn from its users so it will become a reflection of their behavior. One needs to explicitly teach a system in this context about what is not appropriate to say, right? Much like we would teach children. Okay, next slide. Let's fast forward to just late last year. How many people have heard about Nothing Forever? One person, great. How many people recognize this logo? Yeah, okay, many of us do, right? Nothing Forever was an endless AI-generated Seinfeld parody that was streaming 24/7 on Twitch, a social media platform Twitch, that launched this past December. Since then, it's gone viral. And like the Seinfeld show itself, there's an easy familiarity to Nothing Forever's repetitiveness. The show's AI cast iterates on the same stand-up bits and conversations about fictitious restaurants in a soothing, seemingly unending riff. To some observers, it seemed like the show was a harbinger of the soon arriving future of AI-generated media. And, we have to see this in the context of things like these large diffusion models like DALL-E 2 or Stable Diffusion or Midjourney, right? These image generators that have cropped up all over the place and are doing for the visual space what ChatGPT is doing in the context of text and conversation. Let's go to the next slide. People, however, stopped laughing on February 6th when at 3 a.m. and much without warning, the character representing Jerry Seinfeld suddenly entered into a bigoted tirade in the middle of stand-up set. Within 30 minutes, Nothing Forever was banned by Twitch, and the show about nothing came to a silent end, right? Now, according to Nothing Forever's creators, in the hours leading up to this outburst, this tirade, the show's AI language model, in this case, was built on GPT-3, which is the predecessor to ChatGPT, right? Gets complicated, but so the model itself has a number of different iterations. There are different classes of models, and depending upon how many parameters measured in billions that it's been trained on. So the Da Vinci model, so-called Da Vinci model, is the state of the art, and in the hours leading up to this outburst, the show's model, which was Da Vinci, suddenly began to behave abnormally. And it produced strange scenes in which the show's characters were completely absent. So in an attempt to fix this, the showrunners essentially switched the model to a kind of previous iteration, one called Curie, right, which was Da Vinci's predecessors. Just a few minutes later, after switching this model, Larry's transphobic, homophobic rant began. So AI models, as we see, have a nasty habit of reflecting biases and prejudice, which are all too human, because they are trained on a huge amount of text scraped from the internet. Right? OpenAI which is the research organization in San Francisco, funded by Microsoft, that is developing these technologies primarily. Although, as Bruce mentioned, Microsoft is in the game with Bing and other companies as well. But OpenAI uses moderation filters to try and ensure that ChatGPT, for example, doesn't say anything harmful. And people are constantly trying to find workarounds through this, right? How do you hack it? Right? It's a kind of a known game. It's a genre. Now, while it's tempting to chalk up the bigotry expressed by the Larry character in Nothing Forever as an AI software malfunction, in a sense, Curry's AI was working just as it was intended to work. The AI simply remixes and regurgitates human sentences and sentiments, assessing random bits of language that it judges to be contextually appropriate, right? Again, what words, given this word, what word am I likely to find next to this other word? And in this sense, it's a little bit like holding up a mirror to our culture, or at least to internet culture, one might say. This image can be terribly unnerving, and it's extremely unflattering. So in the ongoing debate over the ethics of AI, art, the potential to unexpectedly expose a massive online audience to hate speech is a heavy risk to weigh, right? In each of these cases, Tay and Nothing Forever, the role of social media in enabling the broadcast of content to such a large audience cannot be underestimated. And I think I'll just leave it here, sort of move on to the next. But thank you.
Thank you so much, Mark. I especially appreciated the popular culture images. Our third panelist is Eva Plonowska-Ciarek, Julian Park Professor in the UB Department of Comparative Literature. Eva's research interests include feminist political theory, critical race theory, not a dirty word, and most relevant to our discussion today, algorithmic culture. She will share with us her sense of the cautionary tales we may want to keep in mind as we move deeper and farther into our AI-assisted present and future.
Thank you, David. Is it working okay? So for me, that prompt suggested that we need to look at the analysis of power. So and everything that Bruce and Mark have been talking about are the elements of power relations, algorithmic systems, humans, internet, its whole network. And I'm using an intersectional approach to this power analysis. And if we have time, I want to focus on one particular use of algorithmic work of power, namely calculation of recidivism score algorithm used in criminal justice. I want to make two acknowledgements to the algorithmic contributions to this presentation. First, this image of racism and power was generated by algorithm. See how sanitized it is. Second, the title Compass has been misspelled by algorithm to double S. I left it be, it's acronym. And I received an editorial score of 83 by Microsoft Editor, unasked. And I don't think that this score would land me a job. But I think there's something. So my question was, what is the relationship between recidivism score, probably somewhere in the middle, and this editorial score, negative score? I got good points for inclusive analysis, very bad points for complicated and formal language. So I want to say something about fantasies of domination and technologies of power that was suggested to me through the juxtapositions of two books on my bookshelf. One is Why Machines Will Never Rule the World, Artificial Intelligence Without Fear. It was co-authored by also a colleague of mine, Barry Smith, whom I don't know personally, but know his work. And the other one, Captivating Technology, edited by Black feminist Ruha Benjamin. And I think this juxtaposition for me raised a question about a vicious feedback loop between all these technologies of power that we were talking about and fantasies of world domination and machines will rule the world and fantasies of the loss of mastery. How do they sort of produce a vicious feedback loop? So the fear, in fact, is often an implicit justification for more surveillance technology. And I also want to say that I'm using the question of power in an ambiguous way, deliberately ambiguous way. So it's neither one nor two. It stretches from deadly violence, systemic power, to the power of imagination to imagine different opportunities and different uses for technology. So again, I don't want to say everything is bad. It's how technology itself is an instrument of power and in what kind of network it functions. So the next slide, that was the book I was talking about. Sorry, Cynthia. This Why Machines Will Never Rule the World. It's a deeply reassurance title, Without Fear. And what is supposed to dispel our fear is a mathematical proof about its impossibility. I don't think mathematics works as a good therapy model for social anxieties. And the second one, the analysis is of captivating technology in multiple senses of captivation, carceral, but also capturing our attention in certain kinds of ways in order to redirect them toward the worst possibilities or redirect our attention from not thinking about what we need to think about. So let's go to the next slide. I could not resist putting Cathy O'Neil book, Weapons of Mass Destruction, very highly recommend. Atlas of AI as a sort of examples of feminist work of intersectional analysis of power. And my next project is to think about the relationship between digital racial capitalism and feminist analysis. So the next slide, sort of a lot of work and homework for me. And let's go to slide number 5. I just want to remind you what you probably know, that the term intersectional analysis of multiple power relations is one of the key methodologies developed by Black feminist thought, and that my argument is that it also provides a very useful framework to analyze the relationship between artificial intelligence and power. And we're staying on this slide. At the bottom of this is sort of some of the relations that scholars and activists who look at relational intersectional analysis of power have analyzed. What is the relationship between subtle colonialism, economic exploitation, gender discrimination, white supremacy, disparities in access to education, healthcare, and housing? And that's an important point, this last one, because it has an impact on criminal justice, and how this relationship of power fits into our system of democracy and its ideal and principles of democratic self-governance, freedom, and equality. So these contradictions are, on the one hand, very well known and frequently disavowed. And I'm again reminding, putting them on in the middle of our conversation because I'm interested in the implications of these contradictions for criminal justice itself. So let's move to slide number 6. Again, intersectional analysis of AI. I'm building here on the work of like Kathy O'Neill, who claims that what Mark and Bruce have already talked about, that despite their reputation for impartiality, models themselves and not only users reflect goals and ideology, especially of tech companies who work for profit. An example of this would be like, do we really need autonomous cars when we desperately need public transport, affordable public transport? In the context of the intersectional analysis of AI, what Mark was talking about is what is the data that is used for machine training and how that data itself, whether it's speech on the internet or other data, is shaped by history of systemic, economic, and gender domination. And in this context, for instance, think about how practices of redlining, which are not practices of artificial intelligence, are encoded as places of criminality and then algorithmically enhanced as the hotspots for predictive policing. But I'm also interested in the emergence of new hierarchies of power and knowledge between those institutions who have political and intellectual capital to design the tools, right? Like those chat boxes, for example, and communities and ordinary citizens who are subjected or allured or willingly participate, interact with those tools, and probably so, and the consequences of these interactions that Bruce was talking about. And I think one effect of those hierarchies of power that we have very little to say about what kind of technologies we might want and use and need to advance the goals of social justice. Since I've been talking about fascination, let's go to number 7. One technology of power, given my own personal history, that I'm obsessed with is called anti-black black boxing. Black boxing is the term that is used by, introduced by Frank Pascal, and it's meant to call to our attention this deadly combination of lack of transparency, which is economic, technological, as Bruce was talking about. We don't know technologically, but also it's a proprietary algorithm. It's politically non-protected. So we don't know what kind of data goes in, what data goes out. But also secrecy, increased secrecy in the public space. For instance, what does it mean to use black box algorithms that are not open to public sphere scrutiny in the public institutions, in the democratic system? And particularly the use of that for one public service, predictive policing, but also hiring, etc., etc. And again, think about my credit score at the very beginning for, not credit score, the score from the editor. It's meant to habituate us, I think. It startled me. I did not ask for this, but the way it popped up, I think it meant to habituate that we are scored and ranked and surveilled all the time. And if that's the case, and if we kind of think about the wide use of this often unreliable and unsupervised algorithms in the government and governmental institutions, is it still a democratic society? And this government by algorithm, it's not my phrase, it's a title of the report by Stanford lawyers, computer scientists, etc., that investigated a very confused, very haphazard implementation of those unreliable algorithmic tools in housing policy, in distribution of social benefits, immigration, and so forth. So let's skip slide number 8 and go to one example of this anti-Black black boxing secrecy and surveillance that embeds racism in it. Anti-Black boxing was the phrase coined by Ruha Benjamin, namely how a COMPAS algorithm, which calculates recidivism score, works. And again, it's private company. It's a black box algorithm. You cannot know how it works. And it is used to predict recidivism risk either in pretrial, bail, or post-trial assignment of punishment. I don't have access to algorithm, and even if I did, I would not be able to understand it. Bruce would. So we would need to look at it together, or other computer scientists. However, what you could look online, and this is truly appalling, is the data categories that are used to feed into this algorithm to predict recidivism score, the possibility of criminality. So we can move to next slide. The first part is supposed to be just criminal, but criminal involvement of the accused is not understood as being sentenced for a crime. It is simply counted as contact with the police, being stopped by the police. So you can see this vicious feedback loop. On campus, we are not policed. The white crime areas are not hotspots for predictive policing, like financial districts. Poor neighborhoods are criminalized by those frequent policing. And the next three categories are, in fact, the questions that are posed are about the criminal past. However, what is particularly troubling, if we look to page slide 11, are non-criminal categories used to calculate recidivism scores. And here you have the whole slew from, are your friends criminals? Do you suffer from abuse problem, poverty, lack of education, criminal parents, divorced parents, social environmental problems, where do you live, leisure and recreation, do you play golf or something else, residential instability, which is a nice sanitized term for lack of affordable housing, socialization failure. When I do it with my students, we would, if we were living somewhere else, we would all score very high on this recidivism score, because loneliness is one of the incriminating categories, and criminal social isolation and so forth. So if you don't have that many friends on social media, you might be charged more. So my question is, if we go to page slide 12, is what these categories are doing. These categories, these non-criminal categories, in the context of the contradictions of democracy, should be grounds for reparations, for reparative justice, for some form of reparation for victims of oppression and discrimination. Instead, they are inverted and into blame the victim kind of equation. So we have criminalization of inequality, poverty, unemployment, lack of housing, personality, like I can be very lonely oftentimes, education and gender. And so we see here the criminality, the absolute disqualification of any reparative idea of justice for the sake of punishing the victims of these systems of oppression. And the last slide, I will not comment, but this became very prominent case that went to Supreme Court of Wisconsin. It was challenged on legal grounds whether one is in fact can be have a right to due process if one cannot look at the secrecy of algorithm, whether one is judged for individual offenses when your score is based on the group that you associate with, and actually the actual use of gender in the calculating the score. Racial categories are not allowed, but if you are a man, you have if you are classified as a man, you have a higher score of recidivism. Thank you very much. Sorry to end with such a depressive note.
Thank you so much, Eva. Jasmina will pick up the mood, I'm sure. She's an assistant professor in the School of Information Studies at Syracuse University, where she teaches courses on the social and environmental effects of data and artificial intelligence. Jasmina Tasheva graduated from UB with a PhD in management and is currently working on her second doctorate in comparative literature. Jasmina's main interests are at the intersection of technology and transnational queer and feminist theory, and her work in this area has appeared in journals such as Big Data and Society. Jasmina.
Thank you, and thank you, everyone. Before I begin, I just wanted to point out that contrary to how the rest of my presentation may sound, I'm not here to make any grand pronouncements about potential solutions to the problems that we have gathered to debate today. However, just looking around this room, I want to acknowledge that this is perhaps exactly what Silicon Valley may need. I see in the room physicists, I see mathematicians, computer scientists, humanists, I see intergenerational dialogue, I see many diverse backgrounds, identities, and I think this is one of the key components that I believe is currently still, unfortunately, missing in those corporate rooms where the destiny, not just of algorithms, but of all of humanity and the planet more generally gets decided. And same goes for their academic conferences, professional conferences, and so on. They're extremely homogenous, and this is a big problem. I also wanted to point out that contrary to my co-panelists, my presentation is not, even though the main ideas still are derived from books and from the people writing these books, many of whose names we got to hear, like Cathy O'Neil, Ruha Benjamin, Safia Noble, Kate Crawford, and so on. Again, every time I make it a point to point out that it's not a coincidence that most of the people working on these ethical and societal problems are women, and particularly women of color. But I wanted to point out that due to the lag between when these scholars get to publish their books and also my own academic laziness, my presentation is focused on a different kind of library and epistemological space where a lot of these AI debates get discussed, which is Twitter. So a lot of these insights and the materials that you're about to see are derived directly from there. Many of the authors that we heard about do debate these ideas on there, and despite of the debacle that Twitter is nowadays, I believe that it's still an important place for this public discourse. So if all right, and case in point, this is a tweet that represents many of the implicit biases that we're by now all too aware of algorithmic systems, and Google search is one such extremely black boxed and yet widely used algorithmic system. This is not new. This is, I believe, a tweet from 2016, and here we see the contrast of whether you're looking for unprofessional hairdo versus what a professional hairstyle looks like. As you can see, even though it sounds like this is a question of aesthetics, it's much more than that. You can see a clear racial bias here. However, I do want to point out that what I've been noticing is a shift from this kind of discourse where we all agree that it's our lives nowadays are not just algorithmically assisted, they're algorithm driven. And so we do, and this was the main thrust of public discourse in the past few years about how these algorithms are ruling our lives. They're working quietly, insidiously in the background, and we are puppets in their hands. We're passive players in this vicious ecosystem. However, as we can see from the next slide, there is a notable shift in this, which is particularly with the rise of ChatGPT over the past few months, not GPA, GPT, I'm sorry. Over the past few months, we are seeing how we as society are turning into active participants in this vicious game, which to me was very interesting because nowadays, we're not simply saying that algorithmic oppression exists. We're saying something like, from what I can understand, just by judging how many of my colleagues and even myself are using ChatGPT pretty much on a daily basis in our lives now, that we're saying, yes, there is algorithmic oppression, and yet these algorithms are cool. These algorithms save a lot of time. These algorithms can do incredible things like write emails for me, and it's true, write presentation outlines. I'm thinking, even though my PhD advisor is here in the room, of even trying to see what ChatGPT can generate in terms of a dissertation proposal outline. And no, that's not going to end up being the final product, but there's a lot of discussion around these topics. And so I'm fairly concerned that from just passive victims, in a way, of these algorithms, we're turning into willing participants in their operational force. And so another part of this, if we can proceed to the next slide, is these algorithms actually seem to have a lot of the toxic masculinist discourse, and the participants in this discourse particularly kind of concerned. Even on Twitter, there's discussions now that ChatGPT may be overly liberal. It may be expressing explicit gender bias against white straight men. However, as the next slide will show you, when I tried doing this myself a few days ago, it did not, or it did rather generate jokes both about men and women. And so I wanted to point out, it is not a coincidence that even though we probably have heard by now, these models are probabilistic, meaning a good way to think of them is, and this is the title of a scientific paper that does speak to a lot of these issues that I highly recommend, that was very prescient in this area, called The Dangers of Stochastic Parrots. Yes, as my co-panelists said earlier, these models are nothing but stochastic parrots, robotic parrots that just repeat back to us what they have gathered from the darkest corners of the internet space. And yet, even though a good way of thinking about them is as autocomplete systems or kind of a next step prediction models, because all they can do is, as we already heard, predict what we're likely to see if we give it a prompt, or which can be considered a task to be finished or to be provided the next step of, if you think about it. The answer in these dialogues or chats between humans and ChatGPT look very much like this. And yet, despite the fact that it's a probabilistic mathematical model that seized its data ingestion sometime, as far as I know or remember, in September of 2021, and this is why it can't answer questions like what is going on in Ukraine right now correctly, or what just happened in Turkey and Syria a couple of weeks ago. We do get very different results on queries that we pose to it just in the span of several hours. And so the reason for this is, and it got cut out from the slide, but there was actually a small banner that said that this is a version of ChatGPT from February 13th of 2023, which means that even though the system is out for everyone to use, it does get updated constantly. But by updating the system, we don't mean that we reintroduce it to all this training data from all over the internet that it was originally trained on. Rather, it means that there's a huge amount of human labor. And I want to emphasize that because there are humans in the loop. It's just not on the deployment side of it, but rather on the training side and then fine-tuning side of these models. But I want to emphasize these different versions that we keep seeing. The reason why we may think that ChatGPT is increasingly improving is not the same reason as Tay was improving, because for all intents and purposes, it's quote unquote seen all the data that it was trained on. No, it's because there are these small patches that are progressively instituted by humans, human labelers, to make sure that it is not as racist or as sexist or any other type of expression of systemic oppression that is entering these systems. And if we can go to the next slide, I want to point out that we are observing here, as with other similar technologies, including Stable Diffusion, any other types of AI-generated art platforms, these large language models are also a perfect example of what some of the people that I follow on Twitter and that I'll introduce you to later on that are authoring these incredibly important books and reports on the dangers of AI, refer to as AI hype. So we're still in the beginning of the cycle of AI hype that is coming to us through ChatGPT. We heard that Microsoft just invested $10 billion into the company behind ChatGPT, OpenAI. It adopted it as part of its Bing search engine and so on. But what is less known and yet still very important, as I mentioned earlier, is these are not quote unquote automated systems. These are systems that use vast amounts of human labor. And in some of these books that we heard about earlier, this form of creating algorithms is known as fake automation or faux automation, because they're sold to us with the promise that they can make our lives easier, that they're fully automated, which somehow is supposed to mean that they're more objective, that they rely on mathematics and logic rather than the flawed human brain with all its implicit biases. And yet what happens behind the scenes is events like this, finding out, for example, that ChatGPT, the all-powerful, most powerful large language model in the world today, actually relied on the work of underpaid Kenyan workers that were paid anywhere between $1.3 and $2 per hour to label these data sets to ensure that whatever it returns back to us is not, as I mentioned earlier, overtly oppressive. If we can move to the next slide. This is why in the book project that I'm currently working on with a colleague from Syracuse University, we also believe that an intersectional view of AI is the most appropriate, because AI systems are not just technological systems. They're not even just socio-technical systems. They're systems that involve humans, technology, but also the economic systems that they operate within. And unfortunately, some of the research nowadays tends to forget that we exist within a capitalist system that that is based on profit. And this entire AI hype, the reason behind it, and what I'm most concerned about in the fact that we are becoming active participants in this, we are helping to point out to these companies like OpenAI the obvious drawbacks, weaknesses, blind spots of these systems. We're doing their work for free through all of this public discourse that we generate on Twitter. And this is why my co-author and I believe that it's increasingly important to understand AI as operating within this form of empire, which is not any sort of a new never before seen kind of system, but rather the only logical progression of centuries upon centuries of colonialism, racism, capitalism, and heteropatriarchy. As David promised, I don't want to leave you on a bleak note, so we do have set of practices that we have identified, which we refer to as data resurgence, which is our answer to what people in our communities are, or at least seem to be doing together in order to resist what we refer to as AI empire. Again, drawing on insights from indigenous studies, from post-colonial, decolonial, feminist and queer studies. Our answer to this, again, not as something that we personally have come up with, but just putting together, collecting all the work of the brave researchers, activists, and communities that are still leading the charge against AI empire. We believe that AI as an empire, as a complex ecosystem, is a system that has managed to achieve some pretty impressive goals. It has managed to sell to us the idea that work is going to be made easier for us, that our lives are somehow miraculously going to be better, but it does not have a clear purpose other than increasing the profits of the companies behind these systems. There is no such thing as thinking about actual human flourishing here, about liberation, about togetherness, about community building. And yet these are the things, and we know from psychology, even the most, the epitome of empirical work, that happiness is not derived through wealth. It's not even derived through material possessions. It comes ultimately from community. And so with ideas from indigenous studies and post-colonial and queer studies, we strongly believe that what we should be focusing on is not so much what parts of the current AI ecosystem are good and salvageable and what parts are bad. I believe it's more important to focus on the fact that ultimately, whatever progress we achieve in AI is built on an extremely flawed, racist, colonial, misogynist, homophobic, ableist structure. This is the foundation. It's a rotten foundation. So I don't see any other way around this other than coming together and re-envisioning the entire process of technology together in a collective form through deep relationality rather than deep learning. And I'll leave it at this.
Thank you so much, Yasmina. So what a terrific and slightly terrifying panel, isn't it? I think it deserves a round of applause. Now, on the slightly terrifying aspect of it, I want to pick up the conversation on basing my comments on something that Yasmina just said. It's implicit in all the presentations here. Profit. Profit seems to be at the base of much of the impulse to deploy algorithms in the public arena. Profit. Why profit? There is there are some valuation assumptions underneath it all. Valuation assumptions that come from what Yasmina was just talking about are very economic structures. This is something that Cathy O'Neill picks up as well in her book when she talks about it's not just that algorithms are opaque and unaccountable. It's also that most of these algorithms their efficiencies are about maximizing profits. And what that means, Cathy O'Neill puts it very clearly, and she's a data scientist. She's not a theory head or a critical theory head or whatever we want to say. She's a data scientist. And for her, it's very clear. It's very simple. Profits end up serving as a proxy or a standing for truth and the public good. And this is the real danger that she sees. So I would like, if you guys have a way of teasing out these issues and trying to figure out, what can be done. A lot of what we've been talking about here is about what we need to know. Now the question, and I think all of you have touched on this slightly, but I would want to try and get us to a place where we can refocus the conversation on what can be done, what we should and could be doing. Anyone? Any takers?
I mean, I can try to start, but so in one chapter in the book that I just published, I look at the project for the Toronto waterfront called Sidewalk Toronto. Is anybody familiar with that project? Right, some people are. Okay. For those of you who aren't, just briefly, it was an effort by a company called Sidewalk Labs, which is a sibling of Google. I guess you would say a child of Alphabet Inc. And this was a joint effort with a public-private partnership in Toronto to develop a section of the waterfront and to base it on smart city ideologies and techniques and methods. One of the things that drove this project was, of course, the data that was potentially able to be extracted from not your online purchasing actions, transactions, interactions, but your everyday interactions in public space. So, for example, how many people are crossing this intersection at this time of day? How many people are taking public transit versus private Uber, Lyft? How do we monetize the curb, for example, creating an auction platform to dynamically price, surge pricing, for instance, brought to parking time at a curb. So you would pit Uber versus FedEx versus an personal individual, right? In terms of how much it's going to cost you to park at this curb. All of this data is valuable, right? Because it can be, on the one hand, extracted, but then used to develop models for pricing of things. The question is, what other aspects of living in a city, in this case, that neighborhood of Toronto, right? Quayside, it was called. What other aspects are outside of the dominant models for business logics, right? What's the business model for staring at clouds, right? What's the business model for people watching? Right. So rather than try to understand how we take these activities, which are, I would argue, fundamental to urban life, and transform them into something that's monetizable, we go the other direction, right? And we look at those aspects and those qualities of urban environments which are unattributable, which can't be extracted, can't be mined, and can't be processed in ways that are sold for profit. To do so, we need to valorize these things, not in terms of their exchange value, which someone like Henri Lefebvre, a French theorist thinking about cities, has this treatise on what's called the right to the city, where he speaks about the oeuvre of the city, the work of art of a city, as being constituted in the way cities are practiced, right? How they you as an urban citizen can appropriate public space. You can do things in it, and doing that changes the nature of the space itself and how it's reproduced versus the product of the city. And he's writing in the 60s, 70s, and he's speaking about that in the context of things like real estate, right? Ownership, property rights, and so forth. I'll kind of pass on here, but I just want to end by just saying the one thing that sank that project, it was there was much public pushback in terms of the privacy issues associated with the data collection. There was a minister of privacy at the Ontario, the regional level, which resigned from the project because she thought she was making a smart city of freedom and liberation, and she realized she was essentially aiding and abetting the surveillance state. But it wasn't, in the end, that problem of the data. That mattered and it was important. But ultimately, it came down to the land grab that Alphabet was trying to do. They positioned their proposal on a 12-acre parcel of land based on the idea that to actually achieve what they're proposing, they need to take over the broader site, the 800 acres of waterfront property at the edge of Toronto, for this stuff to work at scale, right? I think this suggestion, the notion that anything we do in the space of technology has to be scalable, right? Has to work at scale, is one of the common criteria you hear at within the context of these tech firms of why an idea doesn't have legs. So let's look at things which are unattributable. Let's look at that which doesn't scale as ways to create and valorize those aspects that we don't want to be colonized by these kinds of technologies.
I have a very modest proposal, and some of the tools that we talked about are well known and irreplaceable. Community organizing, organizations on the ground levels, and many of the speakers and intellectuals have started, like Data for Black Lives organization, Algorithmic Justice League, etc., etc. So organizing is very important, but also like insistence. Like, I'm an educator. What I can do, I can bang my head against the wall, against what is sometimes called tyranny of metrics, a self-evident truth that replaces intersubjective conversations. Like, I cannot use on my syllabus the word evaluation anymore. It has to be assessment, and comes from the state, right? I put it in quotation mark. So just kind of resisting impacts and assessments and putting everything into calculable form on the everyday practices on the one hand, and refusing this as justification for anything. And sometimes it's a hard sell. If you are talking with your provost, for example, and give me the metrics, give me the data. Sorry, the data will not solve the problem, or not even will illustrate the problem for you automatically. So sort of like being a big scale practices, community-based practices, but also everyday small sort of practices, and noticing like the creep of standardization, like this editor score or surveillance. Like, why do I need, like, it's so benign, pops up. You spend your time on the computer device has increased 50% this week or decreased. I mean, what does it do, not for me, but for all of us, in terms of habituation to those surveillance practices? So actively refusing those seemingly benign, small intrusions of standardization and surveillance that's sort of my little thing that I can do and encourage others to do.
Like Bruce.
Bruce, sorry.
Thanks. I wanted to pick up on a topic that all three of you sort of mentioned in some way. In particular, Ava, you spoke about this COMPAS system that looks at recidivism and crime, predictions of crime and stuff like that. Humans designed this. They made certain choices. There are alternatives that are out there. I think about some work by a computer scientist named Cynthia Rudin at Duke, who has looked at alternatives and tried to at least come close to the same kinds of scorings and things like that, but not criminalizing where you live or whether or not you're divorced, but trying to use smaller amounts of data that are more pertinent. The issue is, and I'm sort of guilty about this myself, when we go to try to analyze something, what are properties features that we might collect that might predict recidivism? I don't know. So let me hoover up everything I possibly can that might bear on whether or not somebody's liable to, commit a crime again. Let me take everything I possibly can that would apply to at least most of the people who pass through the system. And then I feed it into these black box, deep neural network things that I can't control and I have no idea how they work. I can't tell you whether or not the neighborhood I live in is an important feature in recidivism because you can't understand what that damn system is spitting out. But decisions were made early to do that. And they were allowed to sort of propagate, and you sort of one reaction may be, well, that's the way it is, and so live with it. But we can go back and say, okay, there may be an overall ethical question about whether we should have AI predicting recidivism or predicting, where crimes are like. If you allow, we should, or it might be helpful, perhaps, choices can get made about how to do this in a different way that is not so blatantly racist and doesn't penalize people for just being poor. Choices can be made, humans can get involved in this, and there can be something that, if you allow the premise that this is a useful thing, still can be made better. And that's not a question that I see being raised any place.
And that's part of the activism that we're
Absolutely.
talking about.
I would like to add to this important conversation the idea that profit and the idea that the purpose of the economic system we unfortunately live in is profitability rather than something like human flourishing or anything like that. Is very intimately related to the idea of technological progress, because as we know, technological progress is one of the most important markers of economic growth, and then growth translates into profit. And so this is how these things are related. And so I would like to argue that perhaps an important step to be made, at least in our minds, is to try and decouple the idea of human flourishing from the idea of technological progress, because the two are not really nearly as related as we are being sold on. And the other aspect of that is, and to sort of continue with the example of the Toronto waterfront, this in and of itself may sound pretty utopian, but if you look up a project called The Line, and some of you may have heard of it in Saudi Arabia, this is something that is actually currently being worked on, and it will be unveiled in the coming years. And it's an entire smart city built in the desert that is supposed to capture every single aspect of our lives, not just what we do on and off the sidewalk, but also what we do inside our homes, what's in our fridge. Not that companies don't know that yet, but I'm just thinking of the idea that there are people out there that actually believe this is a good thing is actually scary, because this is how far we are into this narrative of techno-optimism. The idea that even the most complex problems in our society can be solved by technology. I think this is a very dangerous mindset, an ideology of sorts that we certainly need to resist and refuse, because this is ultimately what drives profit and gets us to where we are.
Thank you so much. Mark will
Just
say
quick-
a few things, and
yeah,
then we'll
just-
open it to the audience.
Great. Okay. I'm going to say then even fewer things because I'm really more interested in engaging with people here. There's a lot of great people in the room. I just wanted to say, Jasmina, I think you've got some really great, suggestions in that last slide of yours, and I've photographed it, so and kind of enables me to look more deeply into it. But I just wanted to say that one thing you mentioned in terms of this notion of a kind of full automation, I want to pose the question: is there even a thing as full automation? Is that ever fully possible? Aren't humans always in the loop? When we think about Compass, trained on crime data, for example, we know the story about CompStat in New York City and how utterly polluted and noisy the data that CompStat produced. Patrol officers changing police reports to consciously lower crime rates in neighborhoods because there was incentives built into the system for the precincts to do that, right? So I would suggest that maybe this aspiration for a fully automated society, this utopic vision that projects like The Line or projects like Ubiquitous City in South Korea and so forth, New Songdo, that it's that myth that we really have to address. And I'm calling it a myth. Right?
Yeah.
Can we?
Maybe the best illustration of that I can think of is a Silicon Valley mogul that, when asked what the next stage of visual technology should be like, he said, well, I think a lot of people would like to choose their world better, meaning what they see in their world. So there will be new glasses and the style of Google glasses that will edit out any aspect of reality you don't want to see. And the example he gave, and I'm not kidding, is like the homeless.